World War I was a deadly conflict that happened between July 28th, 1914 and November 11th, 1918. World War I was one of the most deadliest wars in human history ever. It is estimated that around 15 to 22 million people died during it. The two sides in World War I were called the Allied Powers and the Central Powers. The Allied Powers was mainly composed of France, Britain, and the rest of its empire, Russia, Serbia, Japan, Italy after switching sides, and later throughout the war, America. The Central Powers were mainly composed of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, and Bulgaria. To quickly sum up World War I, essentially what happened was that on June 28, 1914, Franz Ferdinand, the soon-to-be Archduke of Austria-Hungary, got assassinated by the Black Hand, which is this anti-Austro-Hungarian Serbian group. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary officially declares war on Serbia. Since Germany and Austria-Hungary are both friends, they both side together in the war. Russia supports Serbia, so Russia sides with Serbia. France supports Russia and hates Germany, so France sides with Russia. Now, the Germans were in a bit of a pickle. They were surrounded by France and Russia. They had a plan. It was called the Schlieffen Plan. The plan was to attack France first, quickly defeat France, then focus all the attention onto Russia. You see, invading France was not going to be easy because France is heavily protected. So the Germans thought to invade France through Belgium and essentially loop around France. Britain did not like that Germany was invading neutral countries, so Britain, and obviously its colonies and dominions, declared war on Germany on August 4th, 1914. On the 23rd of August 1914, Japan declared war on Germany. On the 31st of October of 1914, the Ottoman Empire joined the war on Germany's side. On April 24th, 1915, the start of the Armenian genocide started to happen in the Ottoman Empire. On May 23rd, 1915, Italy, of course, does what Italy does best and switched sides. They were previously neutral, but had kind of an alliance with the Central Powers, but then decided to switch over to the Allies. On May 7th of 1915, the British Lusitania was sank by the Germans, and 128 Americans died. This kind of pissed off America a little bit, and it kind of swayed a negative opinion on Germany in America. On October 7th of 1915, Serbia is invaded by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria, prompting Bulgaria's entry into the war. Now, Germany is doing very well in the war. Germany is pushing both into France and into Russia at the same time. On January 17th, 1917, though, things start to take a sour turn for the Germans. The Germans sent out this telegram called the Zimmermann Telegram, essentially begging Mexico to attack America. It gets intercepted by the Americans through the British, and on April 6, 1917, America declares war on Germany. Americans will soon start to land in Europe. Eventually speaking, Russia has enough of the war, and there's a lot of famine going on in Russia, and a revolution, and a civil war. So, on March 3rd, 1918, Russia signs a peace armistice with Germany, and Russia leaves World War I. During the spring of 1918, Germany would launch its last offensive. That offensive would later fail, and the Central Powers got pushed by all angles by the Allied Powers. The Ottomans fell first, then the Austro-Hungarians, and on November 11th, Germany signs the armistice and World War I ends. Soldiers' conditions during World War I were brutal. In fact, they were more brutal than the soldiers' conditions in World War II. A big part of why World War I was brutal for the soldiers was because of the trenches. Trenches in World War I were constantly filled with rats, lice, and other pests. Diseases also constantly riddled the trenches. Because the trenches were cold, wet, and unsanitary, a lot of soldiers developed something called trench foot, which is very similar to frostbite, kind of. Another reason that trenches were really bad was because of poison gas and mustard gas. Soldiers had to find a way to clear out the trenches. So in April of 1915, at Ypres, the first poisonous gas attack happened. Later throughout the war, mustard gas started to be used. In 1925, the League of Nations officially banned chemical gas from warfare. Essentially speaking, the trenches in World War I were a very horrible place to be in. A lot of soldiers in the trenches developed something called shell shock, which is what we know nowadays as PTSD. Shell shock, or PTSD, is essentially a mental health issue in which a person goes through a really traumatic experience and experiences traumatic-induced flashbacks. A lot of interesting guns were used during World War I. For example, the Americans used the M1917 Enfield, but they also used other guns such as the M1903 Springfield and the Winchester M1897. The Germans used the Gewehr 98 and the MG08, which is a machine gun. British used a gun called the Lee Enfield and the Lewis M1914. The Russians used the Mosin Nagant and the Nagant M1895, which is a revolver. French used the Lebel Model 1886 and the Lebel 1892 revolver, and the Turks used the M1877. A new piece of technology that emerged during World War I was the tank, which was first used in the Battle of the Somme. Famous tanks from World War I include the Mark IV, the Renault FT, the Sturmpanzerwagen A7V, Fiat 2000, and the Mark V. And of course, I can't forget the infamous Tsar tank, which unfortunately never made it past the prototype stage. Famous jets during World War I included the RAF FE-2, the Fokker Eindecker, the Siemens Schuckert, and the Sopwith Camel. Famous battleships used during World War I included the HMS Dreadnoughts, the USS Arizona, the Schleswig-Holstein, and the Grosser Kurfürst. On June 28, 1919, at Versailles, France, a treaty by the name of the Treaty of Versailles, was signed. The treaty laid out plans for after the war. In the treaty, it said that Germany had to pay the financial reparations of the war, they had to disarm, they had to lose territory, and they had to give up their overseas colonies. At the end of the war, Austria-Hungary also collapsed, and the Ottomans collapsed. This was an absolute humiliation for the Germans. They were probably the strongest country during World War I, and they put up a good fight, but they lost, and they had to lose a lot of territory and a lot of money. And this kind of put a feeling of anger inside the German populace. Later, the Germans would start to think of some revenge, a way to get back at the Allies. For now, things were calm and peaceful at last.